Hey, gosh, sorry about this. He's all right. I'm back. I so sorry about that. Good evening again. We'll try that. So, hopefully this is working. Can you actually? Can you hear me? I had the chat open, but it was too much for my computer to handle. So, hey Mar, I'm sorry to hear about your dog. That's really sad. Well, you know what? You just gotta love that dog extra hard. That's always my answer for this stuff, Because, rough spots in life, but, the one thing that makes a dog, I think, the best pet, in my opinion, is they love you unconditionally. So they could just, be going through the worst spot, in health. But if you, treat them right, we give them a good ear rub, you literally make their day, their whole week. So, I think that is always important to remember. Oh no, you can't hear me at all? Oh. Shoot. Jeremy, can you hear me okay? Or am I just rambling to myself here? Yeah, for a second. Jeremy, you gotta help me out here. Can you hear me? Okay. Smart said you couldn't hear me. So, okay. Anyways, I am going to pick up from wherever I left off here, chapter 10. And apologies for the delay, you guys. And I'm very sorry to hear about your pup, but yes, get over that. He'll get over it. Pups are tough. So, where we left off, they found a dead body. It's most likely Aubrey Hamilton. She's been missing the whole time. All right. Chapter 10. You knew her, I guess, Manfred said. He'd come to stand by Fiji when Olivia had walked away to explain to everyone what they just discovered. I've only heard her name just mentioned. Together, he and Fiji looked down the gentle slope at the wizened, almost skeletonized body. It was not white and clean like the laboratory skeleton. Far from it. There were disgusting wads of hair around the skull, and tendons stretched like dead vines around the bigger bones. The smaller ones were scattered, some right around the corpse. Flying, walking, all the little predators of the area had come to visit Aubrey Hamilton's remains. Her shoes were still there, which seemed pathetic. They had been, bright zoot sports running shoes. When Aubrey had told Fiji how much they cost, Fiji, who bought her shoes at Payless, had almost choked. I did know her, Fiji sighed heavily. She started dating Bobo maybe a little over a year ago, and she moved in about 5 months after that. More or less. 2 months ago, she just vanished. Bobo came back from an overnight trip to Dallas, and she was gone. Fiji looked around for Bobo. He was sitting in the cab of Teacher's truck, leaning forward, his head resting on the dashboard. He was not crying, but what was he thinking? She could not guess. She just left, Manfred said. Clothes and all? No, and all, Fiji said. She just left some stuff in the washing machine. She only took the clothes on her back. She looked down the slope and she shuddered. And the shoes on her feet. Did Bobo report it? Report what? That his girlfriend had left him? They would have laughed. But he did call after a week, because it was just weird that her stuff was there. She didn't have a car, as far as we knew, but all her clothes and her hair straightener and her razor and even her toothbrush, who leaves stuff like that behind? The sheriff sent a deputy over to ask a few questions. He got her phone number and her parents' information, but with no signs of a struggle and no phone calls or any communication, I guess there really wasn't anything to go on. I see what you mean. Did Bobo ever hear from her? Fiji said, I'd have to sit down, and they dragged a couple of the chairs to a spot in the shade. When she was slumped back into the chair, grateful to be off her feet, Fiji said, to answer your question, no. Bobo never heard from her. At the time, I assumed she was being a bitch, putting Bobo through the most hell she could. But I see now how weird that was. You think she'd call to say, box up my stuff and send it to wherever. I just couldn't stand the way you snore or grind your teeth or whatever. But she didn't. She didn't call any of us or send a letter or a text. At least, not that I've heard. Did she have any friends here? Or friends from before she moved in with Bobo? Fiji looked at Manfred, a bit startled. Now that you mention it, no. Isn't that something? None of us liked her much, even the Rev. They both glanced over to the older man, who was hunkered down in the scant shade of a small oak. Fiji was sure he was praying. She nodded approvingly. That was just what a minister should be doing under these circumstances. How did you figure out that Rev didn't like Aubrey? I can't believe you talk about it. It doesn't seem to me that he talks about anything. I deduced it, Fiji said, with dignity. When the Rev would talk to her, his face would get all tight, like he was suppressing something. Fiji tried hard to imitate the expression. She saw that Manfred was trying to suppress a smile. I saw you freeze that woman, he said. I take you seriously. That's good, she said. I like to be taken seriously. I know I look silly. I know everyone thinks I'm either a fraud or deluded, so be it. I don't think you are, said a voice behind them, and Chewie sank down on his heels. I have faith in you. He looked at Fiji. Of course, that's probably my global Mexican background. Right, Fiji said, because you're so superstitious. She and Chewie smiled at each other. I wish the police would come, Manfred said. He smiled too, but not happily. I never thought I'd hear myself saying that. The Midnighters set themselves to wait. Grady began to cry, and Madonna gave him the only bottle she brought with her. Teacher burped and changed him, and Grady fell asleep to everyone's relief. Creek and Connor sat together, hunched in the shade of the truck with Rasta panting beside them. Connor looked excited and frightened, all at the same time. Creek, who had a talent for looking inscrutable, was doing an especially fine job. Chewie took Joe a beer, which he drank in 4 gulps, while the Rev continued his solitary prayer. Olivia crouched by Bobo, who had gotten out of the truck to squat out in the open, staring into the distance. Every now and then a tear would roll down his cheek. Each tear made Fiji more miserable. She fell into silence. Manfred got up to roam around. He went over to the big white boulder to read all the graffiti. He climbed down to the steep slope upstream to look at the dinosaur footprints clearly visible below the running water. Since he'd never known Aubrey, he had the right to fidget. After a few minutes, Olivia seemed to tire of the role of grief counselor. She gave Bobo a small package of tissues for a backpack and she stood effortlessly to walk over to Fiji. I don't know what cracked her chest bone, but she didn't just have a heart attack. I don't think sorry, I don't think so either, Fiji replied. But she did walk and run. She did like to exercise. Maybe she came out here and fell, broke her ankle. Then what was to stop her crawling up the slope? It's not that steep. Why didn't she use her cell phone? You can't tell me she took a step without the phone in her pocket. That's true, Fiji pressed her lips together. Well, maybe she got snake bit and crawled down the slope rather than back towards midnight, Olivia said. She didn't poo-poo the idea that Aubrey had been bitten. This was a place where you had to be aware or take the consequences. That that is weird, Fiji conceded. But I hope they can find some clear reason. There was a lot unspoken in that hope. You saw her after Bobo left, right? Didn't you tell the sheriff's deputy that? Fiji turned her head so that her eyes met Olivia. Of course I saw her after Bobo left, she said. Didn't you? Sure, Olivia said after a moment. Sure, I saw her. Fiji nodded. Well then, the law's here. From the west came two white cars driving carefully. They both had light bars on the top. Fiji had not met the sheriff, but she recognized him from his campaign posters. Arthur Smith, with his thick chest and shoulders and large eyes, reminded Fiji of a bull. His short curly hair, though mostly still a pale blonde, had a heavy sprinkling of silver. She voted for him. Last election, more accurately, she voted against his opponent, a known bully. It was a measure of the previous sheriff's unpopularity that Smith, not a native Texan, had won the contest. Sheriff Smith was calm, businesslike, and in charge. There were no two ways about that. Fiji Kavanaugh, he asked when he emerged from his car. Fiji raised her hand like a schoolgirl. Where's the body? When Fiji pointed down from the right point of the cliff edge, he sent two deputies scrambling down, laden with cameras and other paraphernalia. After that, having looked over the people at the site, one by one, he began by talking to Fiji. She pegged him for about 45 and automatically noted that his wedding ring finger was bare. He didn't have any obvious signs that screamed bachelor, though. It was obviously trimmed, pressed, shaven, and starched. I remember reading your name in the report when Mr. Winthrop first said his girlfriend was missing. You found the body, Miss Kavanaugh? He said. His accent was softer than the local one, from much farther east, though still south of the Mason-Dixon. Yes, we all came out here for a picnic, and I was just walking along the cliff. And what drew you in that attention? The smell, she said bluntly. And who do you think this is here on the slope? Fiji stared at him. The shoes are Aubrey Hamilton's, she said finally, and what's left of the hair is the right color to be Aubrey's. So, he said, Miss Hamilton vanished after Mr. Winthrop spent the night in Dallas. During the time he spent in Dallas, she corrected him. And did you see Miss Hamilton after he left for this business trip? He'd gone to meet with some friends of his in the pawn shop. They talked online and they wanted to meet face to face, so he drove over to Dallas. Did you see her after the time he left? Yes, I did. Did you see her in the pawn shop? No, she said, without even thinking about it. She never dropped into Midnight Pawn after Aubrey was in residence. Never. She could feel her face become tighter. All of her muscles hummed with tension. Then where? I saw her come out of the door, she said. She came out of the side door, not the pawn door. The door to the landing where the stairs lead up to Bobo's apartment and down to Olivia's. She did not mention living room. To get to the apartments, you don't have to go through the door. There's a door into the store from the landing too, but it's usually locked. Arthur Smith was trying very hard not to look impatient. Okay, she came out of the side door. I saw her come out of the door and turn. Well, it would have been to her left, to walk between the pawn shop and the rental house, on her way back to the parking area. Well, this is riveting, I know. I just thought she was going to run an errand, but that can't be right, because Bobo had the trunk. But Olivia had lent Aubrey her car. Without thinking, Fiji turned to look at Olivia, who was in conference with Chewy and Joe. Did you talk to her, or do you know what she planned to do while Mr. Winthrop was out of town? No, she shrugged. We weren't close friends. We weren't friends at all. And who was Mr. Winthrop seen since Miss Hamilton vanished? You mean like dating? No one, she said. He's been really depressed. For once, she surprised the lawman. They both looked over at Bobo Winthrop. He had scrambled to his feet with the revel of the police cars. The wind was blowing his golden hair. It looked like a slightly aged catalog model, maybe for casual clothing or for a rugged lifestyle involving trucks and mountain climbing. He was depressed? Sheriff Smith asked, clearly having a hard time imagining that. Then his cell phone rang, and he got it out of his pocket. Yes, he said impatiently. He listened to whatever the caller was saying. Then Smith said, That's really interesting. Thanks. He hung up. Bobo was depressed, Fiji told him again, determined to make her point. He was really devoted to Aubrey. That's interesting, Smith said, since she didn't exist. Wah, wah. Oh, so how's it going, guys? Doing okay? I know it's a pretty riveting story here, and I left my water bottle lying somewhere over there. We'll see how long I can last without it. Chapter 11. Bobo looked over to see Fiji staring at Sheriff Smith as though he'd informed her the earth was made of pie crust. You could just hear her speak. How can you say that? She asked, and Olivia joined her. The sheriff looked at Olivia, like every man did, but Olivia stood in front of him, with her arms crossed over her middle, her face intent. Let's hear about this, Olivia said. Mr. Winthrop, the sheriff called, and Bobo walked over, his feet reluctant to go in the direction he had to. You could tell this was going to be a bad conversation, as if anything could make this day worse. Fiji, he said when he got to her, what's the matter? Fiji didn't speak, but she didn't leave, and neither did Olivia. Bobo thought the sheriff looked as though he'd like to ask them too. I just heard from one of the deputies, Smith said, looking directly at Bobo. What did Aubrey Hamilton tell you about her background? Whatever Bobo had expected, it wasn't this. What do you mean? He said, floundering about in his thoughts to make sense of Smith's question. His head felt thick as cotton wool, his grief making him slow and stupid. She was working in Davie when I met her. She was a waitress at the Lone Star Steakhouse. What did she tell you about her background? That was definitely an ominous turn of phrase. But Bobo said, she told me her parents were dead and that her sister had thrown Aubrey out of the house when she turned 18. And she'd been fending for herself since. That's what she had told her coworkers at the steakhouse, too. We talked to them briefly when you reported her missing. However, one of my deputies looked a little deeper after we got the call to come out here, since she's the only missing person on our books. None of that is true. Bobo felt the shock clear down to his bones. What are you saying? Bobo asked. He looked at Fiji, whose face would locked down tight for some enlightenment. Fiji said, Sheriff, are you saying that Aubrey kind of made herself up? That's right. Her name was Aubrey Hamilton, right enough, Arthur Smith said. But she's got living parents. She's got no sister. She does have a brother, and she's been married before. But I knew her, Bobo said, feeling that he'd said it often enough would ease what the sheriff was saying. I saw her driver's license. I met her by chance. And then he remembered the two men who'd come into the pawn shop. He began to let a new idea sink into his brain. I thought I knew her. How did you make her acquaintance? The sheriff asked. I love the Lone Star Steakhouse, Bobo said. I go there at least once every 2-3 weeks to have steak. I met her there. Olivia's face flushed red with anger. Son of a fucking bitch, she snarled and stomped away. Bobo watched as the other townsfolk gathered around her, and Olivia began to talk, her hands flying upward from time to time in outrage. Olivia has no problem at all believing that Aubrey was a liar, Bobo murmured, the enormity of this revelation about the woman he loved beginning to sink in. I don't either, said Fiji, almost in a whisper. She put her arm around him awkwardly, and he could see the unhappiness in her, the unhappiness she felt on his behalf. The rest of the Midnighters had clustered around Olivia. Even Madonna, who'd been glowering at the crowd while she sat in the pickup with the door open, came closer with Grady in her arms. Smith gave a loud, exasperated sigh. Bobo figured that he hadn't planned on telling the whole community at once, or this early, but the sheriff must have decided to make the best of the situation, since he raised his voice to a public announcement level. I might as well tell you all at the same time. Aubrey Hamilton was not the woman she said she was. More accurately, she was Aubrey Hamilton Lowry. The people of Midnight moved closer to Smith, Bobo, and Fiji. Bobo saw that they were all tense and angry, and if he'd had room for any other emotion, he would have felt touched. Married? The Rev looked as though the word had been torn from his throat. He looked even sterner than usual. Formally married, the sheriff said, though she told them at the steakhouse that she'd gotten divorced and was in the process of changing her legal papers back over to her maiden name. In fact, her husband, Chad Lowry, was shot and killed by police officers in Phoenix, Arizona. Shot? Doing what? Teacher asked. Robbing a bank. He was a career criminal? Bobo said. He almost hoped that would be the case. Not exactly, the sheriff said. He was a member of a white supremacist group, Men of Liberty. MOL is based in Arizona, but it has branches in all southwestern states, including Texas. No, said Bobo. He turned to face Olivia Charity. It's all part of the same thing, he said. What is? Olivia said, but she narrowed her eyes at Bobo, but caught that warning a second later. It's all part of her pattern of deceiving me, Bobo said, making a good recovery. I was a fool to think she loved me. That made everyone acutely uncomfortable. They all looked away, all but Fiji. He looked down into her eyes and saw nothing but steadfastness. I was a fool, he repeated softly.
Oh, hey, Gil, come in. Howdy, hi.
Oh, how's it going, you guys? Hi, Ancient. And, yes, I'm glad you can hear me. Just reading along. I managed to grab my water this time, so we're good. All right, get comfy, bud. All right, where were we? There we go. I was a fool, he repeated softly. Never, Fiji replied. She was the fool. There was a shout from down the slope, and they all turned to look in that direction. A deputy came up, a woman, her black hair pulled back in a tight bun. She was carrying a plastic bag. In it was an old gun. Smith went over to her and held it up to have a good look. They all stood silent. Bobo didn't know what anyone else was thinking, but he was back in that land where the unpleasant revelations were in the norm. He hadn't lived there in a while, and he hadn't wanted to return ever. Olivia was standing right behind him. He could see from the corner of his eye. She was looking at the gun. I know that piece, she said, making sure her voice was low, but of course Fiji heard her. From where? She asked, equally quietly. Bobo wanted to tell the truth, if only to Fiji. It was in the shop, he said. It's been there for years. The sheriff told them they could go home. Come talk to you individually later, he said. Don't leave until one of us has interviewed you. The trek back to midnight seemed twice as long as the hike to the river. In silence, they straggled back to town, not talking, lost in their own thoughts. Bobo walked alone, not able to bear the company of anyone else, not even his closest friend Fiji. When they got to the pawn shop, Bobo had already gotten the keys from his pocket, and he went in the side door and up to his apartment without a word. Hey. Robin is on an adventure tonight. Chapter 12. Creek and Connor. Here, go down. Hold on. Okay. There we go. Creek and Connor went directly to Gas and Go. Creek had begun crying on the way back to midnight, and her brother had put his arm around her. He had looked almost proud, Peachy thought, at being the one who was standing up to adversity. She hadn't known Creek had ever talked to Aubrey, but maybe it was the sudden face-to-face encounter with death that had shaken the normally serene Creek. The rest of you come to the diner, Madonna said from the window of her truck. We got to eat this food, and might as well do it there. Peachy went Peachy went over to home cooking with the rest of them, since she couldn't think of anything better to do. She wasn't ready to be alone yet. The sight of the horrible remains of Aubrey Lowry, was still too much in the forefront of her mind. Functioning on autopilot, Fiji helped unload the truck and spread out the food on the diner counter, as it had been on the table at the riverside. Everyone filled a plate and found a place at the round table, including the Rev. But, come on. What you doing there? You gonna lay right there? By this guy. All right. Including the Rev. The Nita huddled together to comfort affected even the minister. He hadn't spoken since Fiji had made her discovery, but now, as the last person sat down, he raised his right hand, and they all fell silent. In the name of the God who made us, all of us, man and beast, bless this food and those who prepared it. Bless the soul of our departed sister Aubrey. Despite her shortcomings, may she rest in peace. May we see her at the last rising and greet her with joy. Amen. Amen. The response was ragged, but it seemed to satisfy the rest. From all of half a minute, Fiji felt ashamed of her earlier rage against the dead woman. But when she recalled the look on Bobo's face as he discovered Aubrey's true identity, the rage surged back. She looked down at her plate, suddenly realizing she was hungry. Everyone at the table seemed to experience the same appetite. There wasn't much conversation, but there was some serious food consumption. After all of them had finished, they divided the remaining food. Fiji, walking home with a takeout container, found her thoughts scurrying around in her head like hamsters in a cage. She wondered if she could use witchcraft to help Bobo. She wondered how long Aubrey's body had lain down by the river. She wondered who had killed her and how it had been done. She imagined somewhat vaguely a seance conducted by Manfred, the ghost of Aubrey appearing in the darkened room. What would Aubrey say from beyond the grave? Fiji tried to remember a single memorable thing Aubrey had said when she was alive, and couldn't come up with an instance. And the gun, how had it found its way to the river with Midnight Pond? Fiji knew that if Bobo had used it to kill Aubrey, he would not have left it for anyone to find. Bobo was dumb about people, but he was smart about things. Mr. Snuggles was waiting for her, curled up picturesquely at the foot of her bird bath. He rose and stretched in the sunlight as she approached. "Oh, for goodness sake," she snapped. "Stop being so damn cute." The cat looked up at her with golden eyes, his bushy tail adorably wrapped around his pristine paws. "Yeah, right, it's your second nature," she said, and the cat walked beside her to the front door. As she unlocked it, she said, "Wait till you find out what you missed today, Mr. Snuggles, and Rasta was there for it." Mr. Snuggles gave her a contemptuous cat look and went to sit in front of his food bowl. Fiji got some kibble and dumped it in. Chapter 13. These are ridiculously short chapters. I swear to God, this kind of reminds me of like a Harry Potter books almost, but not even. Like these 2 pages, 1 chapter. Just saying. Most of the Midnighters were wakeful during the dark hours that night. Bobo sat in his apartment over the pawn shop, all lights off, looking north out of the rear windows of the moon, glowing over the land leading to the Rio Rocabria, where Aubrey had lain decomposing for 2 months. He hadn't eaten anything, though Manfred had dropped off some food. He hadn't had anything to drink either, though he thought about having a traditional drinking fountain. Bobo was alternating between feeding some kind of comfort and a lot of grief. At least, between feeling some kind of comfort and a lot of grief. At least Aubrey hadn't left him voluntarily. That knowledge relieved some ache deep inside him. However, he was sure that Aubrey had met with a fate more lurid than a snake bite or an accidental fall, especially since he'd seen the gun. Whether or not she'd been shot, something terrible had happened to Aubrey, and that someone else had had a hand in that terrible something. When Bobo could think of anything besides his horror that a woman that he loved had died by violence and lain in the open for weeks, his grief over her permanent loss, he brooded over the revelation that Aubrey had ties to men of liberty. He wondered if Aubrey had truly cared for him, ever. After a while, he moved to look out the front window, looking over the crossroads and the established midnight. He saw lights come off and on all night as the residents of the town got up, sat for a while, and returned to their beds. Bobo felt lonelier than he ever been in his life. He hadn't talked to his parents in a year, maybe longer, but he thought of calling his sister or his brother. In the end, he didn't pick up his phone. Chapter 14. The next day, everything in Midnight should have resumed its pace. Granted, that wasn't a very brisk pace, but everyone's business should have been open. Fiji opened the inquiry mind right on time, but she watched out her front window anxiously to see if the Midnight Pond close sign would flip over to open. The pawn shop never opened that Tuesday, though. The close sign stayed up all day. As she walked down to the gas and go to get some milk, Fiji discovered Sean Lovell was having a banner day. Some of the law enforcement officers were stopping in to top up their vehicles with gas and to get cold water and snacks. When Fiji went to the counter with her purchase, Creek was working the cash register while Sean ran the credit cards and stocked the shelves. Connor at school? Fiji asked Creek. Yeah, he needs to be busy, and he doesn't need to miss any classes, the girl said. For once, we can use him there. Hey, Fiji, called Sean. You doing okay after yesterday? Yeah, at least you're doing good, huh? Sean shrugged as he tucked some more bags of peanuts into a clip dryer dispenser. I guess so. He didn't seem happy about the rush of business. He seemed exhausted and worried. Be better when Connor gets here. It's almost time for the bus. Fiji glanced over at the desk in the corner that Sean had put there. It was a place for Connor to do his homework. Sean didn't even trust the 14-year-old to do his homework in his own home, a small house to the north of the gas station on the DB highway. Sean Lowell was not a man long on trust, Fiji thought. Not for the first time. The Lowells kept their history to themselves, and everyone in Midnight respected that. Carrying her bag of milk, Fiji decided to walk a little further, down to the antique gallery and nail salon. It was open. To her surprise, there was a woman she didn't know sitting in Chewy's special chair getting a mani-pedi. Fiji had planned to have an idle conversation with Joe, whom she knew a little better than Chewy, who was more reserved. But just as she came in and Chewy told her where Joe was, another customer came in, a rancher's wife from Marthasville. She was there to buy a picture frame, and she had admired the previous week. Next, Fiji crossed the road to home cooking. Madonna was sitting at the counter, working a crossword puzzle while Grady napped. Hey, said Madonna without much enthusiasm. Too late for lunch, but I got some leftovers I can sell you. I just wanted to see how you were doing, Fiji said, knowing as she said it that she sounded weak. She had never dropped into home cooking between mealtimes before, and she'd never set foot in the double-wide trailer set up behind the restaurant. Teacher working today? Yeah, he's working about 6 miles east, helping a retired postal worker rebuild his front steps. That means teacher's doing it while the old man sits watching and talking. Madonna looked longingly at her crossword, and Fiji took the hint and left. The Rev was not in the chapel. Fiji found him behind the fence in the pet cemetery. It was a place that fascinated her, partly because it was one of the few concealed places in Midnight. The wooden fence, the planks pointed at the top, was at least 6.5 feet tall and painted in an immaculate white. The Rev had left the trees in place, so it was peaceful inside. Fiji didn't know how long it had been since the Rev had established the cemetery, but she estimated it was about half full of graves. Some were marked with crosses, some with stars of David, others with pentagrams. There was a cat statue on one little rectangle, a dog's leash mounted on a forked stick on another, and an actual small headstone carved with tonks. There were pictures on frames sticking up out of the dirt, marking some graves. Some were marked only with mounds. What are you doing today? She asked. The old man was standing at an especially large monument in the middle of the occupied area. It's bless the graves day, he said. Oh, appropriate, she said. I'll leave you to it. But she watched for a few minutes, plastic bag with the milk hanging from her hand, while the Rev moved slowly from grave to grave, praying for each departed soul. This ritual, which he performed monthly, often took him 2 days. Seeing he was absorbed in his task, she eased out of the gate without further comment. She looked across the street at Midnight Pond. She glimpsed Bobo's face at the window of his apartment, but he did not raise his hand or acknowledge her in any way. So she trudged back to her house, the milk banging against her leg. After dark that night, Peachy saw that the pawnshop lights were on, and she walked over to the store. She needed some company. She was too wired up to read or to watch television. Lemuel was at his post. Peachy was not at all surprised to find that Olivia had come up from her apartment to keep him company. There was a customer, too. Lemuel appeared to be striking a bargain with a strange, hunched man. Gotta stay hydrated. Well, the most interesting people come in at night, Fiji thought. She stepped past the man and she stepped past the men to sit by Olivia in the two chairs that matched the breakfast table. I could kick myself now that I know about Aubrey, Olivia muttered to Fiji, as Lemuel and the hunched man agreed on terms. I should have investigated her when it was more obvious she didn't fit in. She didn't ask any questions about what qualified Olivia to investigate her, how she would have gone about such a thing. If you were going to live in Midnight, there were some subjects you didn't delve into. When were you sure you didn't like her? She asked, trying not to sound too eager to know the answer. After she'd been here a couple of weeks, Olivia replied without hesitation. Fiji suppressed a triumphant smile. Her spell had been effective, maybe. Though, if it had really worked, if Olivia had understood Aubrey's true nature as Fiji had hoped everyone would, Aubrey's true nature hadn't seemed quite as repulsive to Olivia or anyone else as Fiji had hoped. For a moment, Fiji didn't think well of herself. If it requires a spell for Audrey's true nature to become apparent, didn't that mean her false one was pretty damn good? In fact, close to being true? Was Fiji's spell casting only an exhibition of sour grapes? Was it her own true character was open to everyone's interpretation? Thinking of her many failings and weaknesses, Fiji shrank from the idea. What can we do to help Bobo? She said. I'm sorry. What can we do to help Bobo? She said. Aside from saying we saw her after he left, I didn't know you could lie so convincingly, Olivia said. I think that's a pretty damn good thing we did that. If he did that, I don't care, Fiji said, especially in view of what we've learned about Aubrey. I wouldn't have cared even if she'd been a saint, Olivia said calmly. I'm sure our focus should be on who else could have killed Aubrey, and if we find another viable suspect. The hunched man had left, and now Lemuel spun around on the stool behind the counter. Yes, he said. That we must do. The gun is worrying me. From Olivia's description, I remember it. It was here in the shop for years. Lemuel's icy eyes glinted with excitement. Fiji wasn't surprised at Lemuel's being on topic. He'd always had amazing hearing and equally interesting ability to listen to two conversations at once. She respected Lemuel, and she wasn't afraid of him. Much. Once, when Olivia's return from one of her mysterious trips had been delayed, Fiji had offered Lemuel some blood. She'd been glad when he'd taken some energy instead, standing silently in her kitchen, holding her hand for 5 minutes that felt like an eternity. Afterward, he thanked her briskly and then left with as much haste as if he'd done something much more intimate and embarrassing. Olivia had come over to thank her, perhaps a bit cautiously, a bit warily, when she returned. But after a sharp look at Fiji's face, she'd given her a hug, and they'd been almost friends ever since. Now, Olivia said, not only was the gun from here, Bobo took it out to shoot targets a couple of times. Fiji's heart sank at this piece of information. Surely the sheriff would consider that damning evidence. I can think of 20 explanations for the gun being out there, she said, though that wasn't literally true. 2 or 3, maybe, and none of those practically convincing. Sure, so can I. I'm leaving on a short trip tomorrow, but I'll be back soon, and we'll talk about how to get this done, Olivia nodded to both. I'll be thinking on the plane. Where are you going this time? Fiji asked. She didn't know she'd like to travel as much as Olivia did, but it would be nice to find out someday. San Francisco, Olivia said, and from the corner of her eye, Fiji saw Lemuel's head jerk. Obviously, this was new information to him. He began to speak, but snapped his pale lips shut on his comment. Olivia looked at him directly. I'll be fine, she said. Don't worry. Quick in and out. What the hell is this all about? Fiji asked herself. All right. There was no expression on Lemuel's face whatsoever. I'll be fine, Olivia repeated. Lemuel nodded reluctantly, and silence fell. The three sat in an uneasy companionship, Fiji trying to think of a graceful way to leave without being obvious, until a ragged woman came into the pond a very old gold wedding ring in her hand. The ragged woman reeked. There was no other word for it. Fiji had never smelled anything like the odor that surrounded the woman like a cloud. She held her breath as long as she could, which wasn't long enough. Quickly and wordlessly, Lemuel gave the woman $40 and took the ring. The ragged woman, whose stick-like figure and huge dark eyes made her look like something out of a cartoon, hurried out into the night, her movements both furtive and jerky. Lemuel turned the ring in his fingers, holding it close to the desk lamp. N.E.S. to his Letitia, he read. It's engraved to the inside of the ring. Where'd she get that, I wonder, Fiji asked. I suspect she dug up a grave and stole it off a corpse's finger, Lemuel said. Oh my God, Olivia said, her nose puckering with disgust. That's just rank, Fiji agreed. Has the sheriff come by to talk to you? Lemuel suddenly said. No, he spent this morning with Bobo, though, Fiji said. I saw his car. She didn't try to sound disinterested. They'd known it was a lie. He didn't talk to me, Olivia volunteered, but I did notice he drove over to the Reed's place. From the most involved to the least involved, Lemuel said thoughtfully. I must think on this some. And maybe there's something about the Reeds we don't know, Fiji thought. Chapter 15. On Wednesday morning, Manfred woke up thinking about the people of midnight, starting with the mysterious Olivia. When Manfred imagined her with Lemuel, it gave him a frisson of something he didn't care to examine. He called it distaste. Based on Manfred's own experience, he couldn't deny that Lemuel had a powerful presence, though if Lemuel had been human, he'd hardly have been an attention grabber by virtue of his looks alone. As Manfred ate whole wheat toast at the little fornica table his grandmother had in her own kitchen, his mind next wandered to his happiest thought target, Creek Lawwell. He wondered how she'd feel today. He noticed the discovery of Bobo's girlfriend's body had been both shocking for Creek and exciting for Connor. Manfred figured neither of the kids had encountered as much death as the other Midnighters. Creek had locked down emotionally after a few tears, while Connor had looked from one person to another, soaking it all in. Manfred had worked the day before, as usual, but he paused often to think over the disastrous picnic and the lack of grief over the death of a young woman they'd all known. None of them had looked shattered, besides Bobo and the flash of sadness from Creek. And that brought Manfred full circle back to the girl at Gassinco. Reaching a sudden decision, he downed the last of the Coca-Cola, his morning beverage of choice, and left the house to saunter past Midnight Pond and navigate the Davie Highway 3 cars before crossing the apron to the belled front door of the convenience store. Inside, everything was bright and shiny and fluorescent. All the walls were freshly painted, and the linoleum was clean. A dark-haired man in his early 40s was behind the high counter. He was loading cigarette packs into the display as Manfred entered. He locked the clear plastic door and turned to face him. Hi, he said, leaning over the counter to extend his hand. You're the new guy, right? Manfred. I'm Sean Lowell. Nice to meet you, Sean. Yeah, I'm the newbie. I came in here to pick up some stuff. Sure, what do you see is what we got. Sean swept his hand through the air to indicate the shelves of junk food and small necessities like batteries and tissue and cooking oil. Sean Lowell looked like every man, about 5'10", short dark hair with a little gray, not thin or fat, clean shaven, no scars, birthmarks, or moles. If the movie role had called for a generic guy, Sean Lowell would have been up for the part. But while he was smiling, he was wary. That was an interesting thing. Sean was an easy read. Manfred bought a Coca-Cola, a box of graham crackers, and some Slim Jims. He placed them on the counter and hauled out his wallet. He could hardly ask exactly where Creek was. He'd been sure he'd see her. How are Connor and Creek? I mean, after what happened, he asked, hoping to come at his goal sideways. Sean said they were pretty shaken up, but they almost sounded neutral. Manfred could feel the tension and anxiety in the man. He supposed that was natural in a father whose teenagers had been exposed to the nastier side of life. I'm glad they didn't see the body, Manfred said. Me too, especially Connor. Immediately, Sean looked as if he'd wished he hadn't spoken. Manfred was so tempted to say, "Why not Creek?" But he knew that was any singular mention of Creek would be a mistake. "Glad they're okay," he said, his voice as neutral as Sean's had been. He took his bag of unnecessary purchases and turned to leave. "Good to meet you," he added over his shoulder. "I think now I know everyone in town." "See you, man," Sean said. It looked as if he hoped he wouldn't see Manfred any time soon. The bell over the door rang as a patrol officer came in, and this time Sean turned away as if he were glad this conversation was over. Manfred nodded and left. As he walked back to the house, he thought, Sean Lovell is one tense guy. I guess like everyone else here, he's got a secret. Manfred was almost tempted to try to forget about Creek Lovell and her smooth skin and her intelligent eyes. Getting past her dad was going to be a piece of work. I should locate the nearest honky town and meet a woman my own age, he thought. But the idea was kind of ridiculous. He was not much of a bar person. He liked parties well enough, but he didn't know anyone in the area who'd invite him. He was not a churchgoer, he was not political, and he knew all too well the perils of meeting someone online, especially since Creek was so wonderful. He shook himself. This was a circular train of thought, and he had work to do. Manfred put the Coca-Cola in his refrigerator, the graham crackers on the shelf that was served as his pantry, and the Slim Jims he had slid into the drawer of his desk for emergency rations. His phone rang, and he picked it up. "Bernardo the psychic," he said. "Yes, Anita Lynn. Tell me what's troubling you." He settled in to listen. He noticed absently that the tree outside his east window was moving in the wind. Across the street, that brisk wind was causing Fiji trouble. Her curly hair blew around her head like a light brown nimbus, and she couldn't see a thing. She was kneeling next to the rose bed that ran around the low back porch, snipping the dead heads off the bushes. This was the last time she'd have to perform the task this year. Before long, the first frost would fall, and she'd prune the roses back for the winter and cover the soil with pine straw or hay. Soon, very soon, she had to start putting on her elaborate Halloween decorations. What costume would she wear this year? She was trying to think about anything besides Aubrey Hamilton Lowry. "Fiji," called a voice, and she was surprised when she swiveled around and looked up to see Bobo standing to her left. He'd come around the side of the house. His blonde hair was blowing in the wind like hers, but his eyes were surrounded by dark circles, and his clothes hung as though he had lost 10 pounds in the past 2 days. He looked like hell warmed over. "Come have a seat on the back porch," she said, trying to sound easy and natural. "I just got a little more to go." Self-consciously, she bent again to finish her task, all too aware she was presenting her posterior to his view. "Go get a Coke out of the refrigerator if you want one," she called, "or put on some coffee if you'd rather." He was out of his apartment. He'd come to her house. She tried not to feel as ignoble blast of She tried not to feel an ignoble blast of jubilation. Bobo went inside and returned with a cold drink. He didn't speak, so neither did Fiji, and it seemed oddly companionable, her working while he watched. The sun on her back made her feel relaxed and a little drowsy. A pile of dead heads in the bucket mounted up into a satisfying way. She kept at her task until she could not find another single one to top off. "I'm scared to ask how you're doing," she said, heaving herself up to her feet and stripping off the thick gloves. It was time for her to open her shop, but this was more important. "I loved her, so I missed her. She died, and I'm sad. She lied to me, so I'm hurt. I have enemies, so I'm worried." Peachy couldn't think of anything to say in the face of such honesty. She dusted off her hands before placing her clippers in the bucket, along with her gloves. Setting the bucket aside to deal with the latter, she went in to pour some iced tea and came out to sit beside Bobo. She felt ridiculous, suddenly, that when she'd seen the gun, she'd had a split second where she believed it was possible Bobo had killed Aubrey. But he had not told her everything. She wasn't in doubt about that. "You better tell me about this enemy's part," she said. She brought some Keebler chocolate chip cookies and put them on the little table between their chairs. She didn't care if it was 9 in the morning. They were Bobo's favorites. Absently, Bobo took one and ate it in 2 bites, then another. She wondered how long it had been since he had had something to eat. My grandfather owned a lot of businesses, he said. He stared at Fiji's well-planted backyard. Mr. Snuggles stared back, but Bobo's gaze didn't see anything closer than 1,000 yards away. Best of all, when I was a kid, was a sporting goods store. Before the big box stores opened in Little Rock, people would drive for miles to see it. It was really big. A ghost of a smile passed across Bobo's face. He also had a lumber yard and a construction company. He was silent partner in some other stuff. I was in and out of his and Grant's house my whole life. My dad worked for him, and this was this was in Shakespeare, Arkansas. He smiled at her. Big fish, small pond. Peachy's family had never been big in any size pond. So I thought it was hot stuff all the way through high school and into college. But I also came to realize it took me long enough. I was so dumb that my grandfather's political and social views were right up there with Hitler's. Whatever she'd expected, that wasn't it. Really? That extreme? He nodded. Really? He would have joined something like Men of Liberty if none of his old golf buddies would have found out. I loved the old guy. Since I was the oldest grandchild, oldest grandson, he made a lot of me. When he was still physically able, he took me out shooting and hunting, introduced me to lots of his big cronies, encouraged me to make friends with their grandkids. What did you think of that? I never questioned it, Bobo laughed, but not happily. It just seemed natural to me. He would tell me why we shouldn't let black people, of course that's what he called them, live in the same buildings with us, date us, intermarry with us. Never got over integration, for God's sake. He was still pissed that black people could eat in the same restaurant as him and Graham, go to school with me and my brother and my sisters. He practically screamed at Mom and Dad to get them to send us to some private school in Little Rock or even farther, maybe Memphis. But to give my parents the credit there too, they wanted us in town with them. Good for your mom and dad. You didn't buy what your grandfather was selling? Fiji asked. She was painfully conscious that she must not cross any number of lines. How did you keep from being totally messed up? I'll tell you something weird. Football and karate saved me. Football because we were all one team and we were all colors. Karate? Fiji asked. Really? Bobo actually laughed. It was great. My sensei was this amazing Asian guy who could kick major butt before breakfast. One of my favorite class buddies was a black guy named Raphael Roundtree and a white woman named Lily Bard. She could knock me down with her little finger. My grandfather revered women as long as they were dependent and decorative. So your class was a revelation to you. She used the extravagant word with some hesitance, but Bobo hopped on it with glee. Yeah. No one in class thought about what color or sex they were. Gaining the knowledge was the thing. So I knew from karate and football, and my own common sense, that there were just as many nice black people, or Jews, or gay people, or whatever, as white people. My grandfather thought were all so wonderful. Revisited resentment made Bobo's face look curiously younger again. I'm assuming your grandfather didn't have a good end, Bobo sighed. When he was well into his 80s, he began using the like-minded employees who worked in his sporting goods store to start stockpiling guns illegally. He was siphoning them from the stock, but my dad, and here for the first time, Bobo faltered. Fiji waited. My father suspected his dad was up to no good. He hired a private detective to work in the sporting goods store, keeping watch and digging stuff up. The guy's name was Jack Leeds. Jack couldn't stop them from bombing a black church. People died. A child, other people. Bobo took a deep breath, almost a sob. One night, I can't remember how, the men working for my grandfather found out that Jack was working undercover. But they didn't know who it worked for. They thought it might be the government, and as you might expect, they went a little nuts. They really hurt him. Another deep breath. They tortured him, right in front of me. My grandfather made me go with him. I was too young to say no and call the cops. I was too scared and weak. Bobo's voice was full of scorn for his younger self. I was looking for a way out when Jack's girlfriend came to rescue him. She was the great fighter from my karate class. That was a lot to figure out, and Fiji wasn't totally sure she had the story straight, but she put that behind her to puzzle over later. So she rescued Jack? Fiji liked that part. Yeah, I'm simplifying, but she did. I just carried my grandfather out of there. He was cursing up a storm, but I couldn't let him stay there and keep on being evil. What happened? All the men involved got arrested, including my grandfather. That's terrible. While Fiji's family had never been rich or influential, none of them had been arrested. Oh my gosh, I picked jail terms to be snobbish about, she thought. She said, what happened after that? Well, my grandfather was out on bail. He had a stroke. He never had to go to jail, but he never spoke again. He died within 3 months. All the other men who were charged got prison sentences. The ones who set off the bomb in the church got life with no parole. Which was right, Fiji said. Those sentences. She stared at Bobo's face. She couldn't discern how he felt about these events. Which was right, Bobo agreed. Which was what grandfather deserved, too. But he dodged that, like he dodged all the responsibility for what he'd done by having the stroke. Peachy found it easy to decipher her friend's emotion now. He was bitter. The point of the story is that after the stroke, supremacist groups began to circulate the rumor that grandfather had a huge cache of all kinds of wonderful weapons, and the rumor turned into a legend, which then became accepted as fact. I visited some of the websites from organizations like Men's of Liberty to After Apocalypse, and it's just horrible the way the story gathered bulk and momentum on its way downhill. So, why did the nutcases think you know about the location of this fabulous treasure trove of weapons? I suppose this is why Aubrey was here? Bobo looked as though he'd swallowed something bitter. Since it was my dad who blew the whistle on my father, the nutcases cast him as the villain. They figured my grandfather would have been too smart to tell his evil son where the arms were stowed. Instead, since I was with grandfather that evening, everything fell apart. Obviously, I was the chosen successor, so I must know where the cache of guns is. Only now it's not just guns. It's rocket launchers, grenades, mines, whatever can kill lots of people at once. That's what I'm concealing. That's the story. And why would you be concealing all of these weapons of destruction rather than putting them to good use against minorities? It's a good question. I'm not sure I know why I'm doing that, Bobo smiled wryly. Is this the first time? I mean, with Aubrey, is this the first time you've been approached? She didn't know how else to put it. No, there were some guys in the pawn shop a few days ago. So what happened? Bobo looked at her, obviously torn. She came very close to leaning over to put her hand on his, but in the end she said, I'll keep it to my grave. Bobo said, Lemuel and Olivia happened. Peachy's mouth opened to ask a question, but then the implication had time to sink in and explain itself. Good for them, she said faintly. Mr. Snuggles butted her leg, and she reached down to scratch his head. The cat's golden eyes looked up at her. If cats had expressions, Mr. Snuggles would be saying, buck up, hang tough, hang tough. She smiled down at that cat. I'm glad they were there for you, she said. He smiled too, but his was not nearly as certain. I was ready to take a beating, he admitted, but I was mighty relieved I didn't have to. Olivia recognized the gun. Bobo knew what she meant the minute the words left her mouth. I don't have any idea how that old Colt got out there. I did take it out target shooting, because I never fired a gun like that, but I brought it back to the shop. Maybe I didn't lock it back in the case. Maybe I left it in the truck. But I know you know I didn't kill Aubrey. I do know that, she said steadily. She suppressed the awful split-second of doubt she experienced. And Olivia knows that too. Even if Lemuel thought I'd killed her, he'd back me, said Bobo, not as if he'd exactly approved of that. Peachy now had had time to think about 100 questions about Olivia and Lemuel, their landlord's protection program, but she kept them to herself. It was not the time, just as it wasn't the time for her strongest impulse, leading Bobo to her bedroom so she could distract him from all these worries. It was too soon. He was still struggling with his conflicting feelings about Aubrey. That was what she told herself. But really, she didn't do it because she feared he would say no. Chapter 16. In the days that followed the first and only annual picnic, the residents of Midnight resumed trundling along their accustomed paths and pursuits, though they all, except Grady, Rasta, and possibly Mr. Snuggles, felt they were operating under a cloud. Manfred certainly felt that way. And when he looked at the faces of the other townspeople, he could read that in their faces too. Bobo opened Midnight Pond on Thursday morning. It was a garbage pickup day, and he wheeled his garbage can to the curb along with Olivia's, which Lemuel shared. Bobo took the time to gather all the newspapers that had collected in the driveway. Manfred watched through his front window as the landlord resumed his life, and he was glad. Manfred saw the other denizens of midnight at home cooking, which had a few more customers than usual, thanks to reporters, law enforcement, and the idly curious. Sometimes the residents could not sit at the accustomed table. Teacher told Manfred he made some extra money changing tires and had gotten punctured on the rocks over by the riverbed. Both Fiji and Chewy made grocery runs to Davy. Fiji got the items on Rev's short list and delivered them to his little bear house. And in her own kitchen, she cooked between helping store customers, so she could take Bobo chicken and dumplings and some seasoned green beans. Another night, Chewy cooked Tex-Mex with Joe's assistants, and they invited Manfred and Bobo to come to dinner. Manfred accepted when Joe called for several reasons. Manfred loved meals. He didn't have to cook. He liked Joe and Chewy, and he understood that their main goal was to get Bobo out of his own place and encourage him to eat some hot food. Manfred and his landlord walked west of the antique gallery and nail salon together, not talking much along the way. And Bobo showed Manfred the outside flight of stairs that led up to Joe and Chewy's apartment. The building itself had been constructed long after Midnight Pond, and as a result, the ceilings weren't as high, so the whole structure was shorter. I'm glad they can't see in the windows, Bobo said as he almost laughed. Can you see down into theirs? I can see a sliver of their kitchen, but that's all, Bobo said, knocking on the weathered wooden door. Come in and welcome, Joe said, standing aside. I'll take those jackets. Manfred looked around him with some amusement. The apartment wasn't large, but it looked amazing. The colors were attractive and harmonious. There were window treatments, and the furniture had not been picked up off the curb before the garbage man could toss it. Manfred had to admit to himself that he had had no idea that the man could make their surroundings look anything more than utilitarian. He was genuinely impressed, and at the same time, he called himself an idiot for not realizing that two people who between them could price antiques and style hair and nails would know something about putting together a good-looking home. It did feel a little strange when the tour included their bedrooms, where Rasta was curled in the middle of paprika and turquoise bed sheet. After 5 minutes, Manfred forgot that Joe and Chewy were men who had had sex with each other, and said he was able to revel in the happy discovery that Chewy was a very good cook, and that Joe kept a stock of excellent beer in his refrigerator. Even Bobo became more cheerful as the evening passed. He talked sports with Joe and raising peppers with Chewy. They talked about the Westminster Dog Show, the difficulty of getting into vet school, Chewy hadn't managed it, and the pleasures and frustrations of buying on eBay. Chewy told them about his cousin Rose's fling from the Home Shopping Network, and how he brought Rose's minister in to pray with her over her addiction. The way that Chewy talked about Rose made Manfred regret his lack of family. After dinner ended with a wonderful pecan pie, Manfred offered to do the dishes. Joe graciously accepted his help. Graciously accepted his help. If Chewy does the cooking, it seems only fair I clean up, he said. But it always is nice to have another pair of hands. Most of the supper dishes went into the dishwasher, but Manfred scrubbed pots and pans while Joe dried them. Afterwards, Chewy showed them some snapshots of his and Joe's vacation in Amsterdam, one of the many places Manfred had not been. As Manfred and Bobo walked home around 10 o'clock, conversation was sparse. Nice dinner, Manfred said, and after Bobo replied, Man, those chicken enchiladas, they both done they were both done with talk, but in a content way. Manfred thought the evening had accomplished parts of its goal in getting Bobo out of his shell. Manfred himself had enjoyed the company because it was not one of his sensitive nights, when he learned more than he wanted to know about his companions. But he was the one who noticed the car parked across Witch Light Road between an empty two-story building. Its ghost of a sign read Rojo Rica Fria Hotel 1920, and the home cooking restaurant. The car was deep in the shadow, even as he recognized the shape of an automobile roof. Manfred was reluctant to emerge from the haze of well-being, but he couldn't ignore the alarm bells going off in his head. He grabbed Bobo's jacket sleeve and yanked him into the alley behind Gas and Go. "What the hell?" Bobo protested, but mildly. "Someone's parked over there in the shadows," Manfred whispered. Bobo appeared to hear the silent alarm signal too, because he instantly moved farther back into the shadows. "Do you see any people?" he asked. He didn't whisper, but his voice was very quiet. "No, and that worries me even more," Manfred said, "because we're right behind you," a man's voice said from the shadows. Manfred wasn't ashamed to tell Fiji the next day that he screamed like a teenage girl in a horror movie. But even as he screamed, he jumped towards danger, not away from it. So did Bobo. Manfred hadn't been in many fistfights or fights of any sort, but he figured if he kept punching, he'd hit something. And he swung away with a wiry windmill. Bobo gave a more practiced exhibit of self-defense. "Help!" yelled Manfred, which was probably the most useful thing he could have done. He had no idea who might hear him at midnight, but he had to try. To his astonishment, a light came on and the back door of Gas and Go flew open. Creek Lowell charged out, swinging a baseball bat. It took her a second to identify the combatants, but when she did, she got behind the man Manfred was fighting and laid into the middle of his back with a formidable swing. He screamed and staggered, and Manfred actually got in a good hit on the man's jaw. Down he went, in a most gratifying way, leaving Manfred shaking his bruised and battered hand. By then, Sean Lowell had pelted from the store to join in the fight, and he grabbed Bobo's assailant around the arms in a bear hug. Bobo socked the pinned man in the stomach, and the air left the man's lungs in a whoosh. He sagged. By that time, Lemuel was there. Manfred, bending over with his hands on his knees and panting for all he was worth, took a second to marvel that Lemuel had heard him call for help from the pawn shop. "Uncle Lem, they were trying to beat up Manfred and Bobo," Creek yelled. She didn't seem to notice her voice was raised. Her eyes were wide, and she was still gripping her bat. "Dad, they were hiding behind our store." She was all over the place, her gaze skittering from one man to the other, her body tense and ready to swing the bat again. "Deep breaths, little lady," Lemuel said. "You have done a good fight tonight. I'm sure Manfred and Bobo are most grateful. "I'm so grateful," Manfred gasped. When Creek looked at him sharply, thinking he was teasing her, he said, "Believe me, Creek." After a couple of more wheezes, he was able to straighten up and look more manly, or at least he hoped so. "Pretty funny," Bobo said. He leaned against the back wall of Gas and Go. "That we were trying to get away from them, and instead we hid where they were hiding." "Hilarious," Manfred agreed. "I called the police," Sean said. He didn't sound pleased at all. He sounded very angry. "Creek, please go to the store and put the bat back where we keep it. Tell Connor everything's okay. I don't want you to have to talk to the cop." "But, Dad, I did so good." Creek was half indignant woman, half floor child. "Sure did, honey, but I don't want our name anywhere in the police report." Sean's voice was even, but you could tell he meant every word. As soon as Manfred's brain began working again, he absorbed the idea that the Lowell's family had a complicated back history. That didn't surprise him at all. The two attackers were conscious, and the one Creek had swung on was groaning. "That bitch broke my back," he said. Manfred knelt by him and made sure the man was looking into his eyes. "You say that again, I'll jump on you with both feet," Manfred told him. There was a rusty sawing noise, and Manfred looked up to discover that was what Lemuel sounded like when he was laughing. The other prisoner, firmly caught by Lemuel's hold, was looking feebler by the moment. The Lemuel effect, Manfred thought, and almost smiled. "I don't know what you said on the phone, Sean, but I can hear the lawman coming from Davy already," Lemuel said, his head cocked to the right side. After a few more seconds, they all heard the sirens. But the first car to get there was a private car with blue lights stuck on top. It was Arthur Smith's car. He was out of it and among them with a speed much younger, Manfred envied. Oddly, Manfred didn't realize the opponent had landed some good blows until he saw the sheriff. When Smith's eyes met his, Manfred became sharply aware that his jaw hurt, and his ribs too. "These two men jumped us," Bobo said, paring the story down. "It was lucky our friends came when we called." "Yelled like a banshee," Manfred muttered. By then, a patrol officer was moving in right behind the sheriff, and Smith said, "Cuff this one and that one," pointing the two assailants. He looked from Bobo to Manfred. "I'm taking your word for it because you live here, and I've never seen these men, so it doesn't make sense that you attacked them." The one on the ground said, "Ask them where Curtis and Seth are. You think we're so innocent?" "Who?" Manfred said blankly. "I don't know Curtis or Seth," Sean said. "You, Bobo?" Bobo spread his hands, and Manfred saw that the knuckles were bleeding. "Not me." Lemuel said, "I don't know them." "They came here," the man insisted, "and they never came back." "We need to think about you rather than your invisible friends," Arthur Smith said, squatting beside the downed man. "You want to start with telling me your name and why you were waiting in a dark alley for these guys?" "I don't want to tell you shit," the man said, trying to sneer, but not managing very convincingly. "Hey, help me up. I can stand now." "Oh, so your back isn't broken?" Manfred said. He stepped back as Smith hauled the man to his feet with apparent ease. The man gasped, and Manfred saw he was in genuine pain, but as Manfred tenderly touched his own ribs, he felt no sympathy at all. "I'm a citizen of the free county of Stronghold," the newly upright man said suddenly. "I'm not obliged to give you my slave name. My true name is Buffalo. I'm a soldier of the Army of the Men of Liberty. You must treat me as a prisoner of war according to the Geneva Convention." That speech stopped all movement. Everyone gaped at him. The second man, who seemed exhausted now that Lemuel had been holding his arm for almost 10 minutes, said, "I am a citizen of the free country of Stronghold. I am not obliged to give you my slave name. My true name is Eagle. I'm a soldier in the Army of the Men of Liberty. You must treat me as a prisoner of war according to the Geneva Convention." "Damn," said the ununiformed officer, who happened to be black. "That's pretty big talk coming from you two. Buffalo and Eagle, huh? Those are the names on your driver's licenses? I'd like to know who enslaved you." "The false government of the United States." Lemuel let go of the second man, who almost collapsed. The patrolman took advantage of the moment to cuff him. Arthur Smith dipped into the pocket of Buffalo, and his hands was clutching a wallet when he pulled it out. This man's slave name is Jeremy Spratt," he said. "No wonder he likes Buffalo better. Tom?" The patrol officer extracted his prisoner's wallet. "This here's Zane Green," he said, "otherwise known as Eagle. He lives in Marthasville, it says here." Smith re-examined Jeremy Spratt's license. "He's from Marthasville, too." He looked at Jeremy Spratt quizzically. "Now, where did your missing buddies live, Buffalo?" "Lubbock," Buffalo said, and immediately looked as though he'd bitten into lemon. "Damn," he muttered. Bobo started laughing, which made Buffalo, aka Jeremy, even angrier. "And why did you drive 30 miles from home to hang around in an alley at midnight? Is there something wonderful about midnight that I don't know?" Both prisoners clamped their mouths shut, and that was the end of their answering questions. They were hauled off to jail in Tom's patrol car, with Arthur Smith following behind in his own vehicle. Lemuel vanished as quickly as he'd appeared, and Manfred wondered why his buddy Olivia hadn't shown. Maybe she was out of town. No one else seemed to have heard the ruckus. Manfred and Bobo thanked Creek and Sean profusely. Creek was still twitchy with excitement, while Sean just as clearly wanted to get rid of them. "Time to go home," Bobo said, and began to walk towards the pawn shop. "You coming, Manfred?" As they crossed the Davy Highway, he added, "Thanks for giving me a heads up, even if we ended up walking into the lion's den." "Sure, that was real helpful," Manfred said ruefully. Bobo laughed. He sounded more like himself than he had since this body had been found. To Bobo, the fracas had been stimulating, apparently. Manfred was deflating like a balloon with each step he took, though. He unlocked his front door in a daze and barely made it to the bedroom before he crumpled. He toed off his shoes, pulled off his blue jeans, and crawled under the blanket. When he was out, he didn't think he'd changed positions all night when he opened his eyes to find the sun streaming around the edges of the bedroom curtains. Getting up was an unexpectedly painful process. Since Manfred had never been in a serious fight before, he was not prepared for how sore he'd be. He hadn't realized he should take some pain reliever, or at least soak in a hot tub before he slept. This is what it must feel like to be old, Manfred thought, as he hobbled into the bathroom. After a hot shower, 2 Advil and a multivitamin, plus some toast and Coca-Cola, Manfred could walk without looking weird. But as he went to his desk, he still felt tender and achy in many places. He gripped the back of the chair, telling himself to sit, but he stood in the middle of the floor indecisively. He felt that he should do something. Go see Bobo, drive to the jail in Davie, call someone. But if Bobo was as uncomfortable as he wouldn't want to be bothered by Manfred dropping in. And what would he do at the jail? Yell at the men who attacked him? And who should he call? His mother would just freak out. He finally resigned himself to sitting down at his computer, with a definite feeling of anticlimax. And there was a knock at the door. He hobbled over to open it. He was astonished to see that his caller was the Rev. He was just beginning to say, "Please come," when the Rev began speaking himself in his rusty voice. He put his thin, mummy hand on Manfred's head. "Lord, thank you for saving this thy servant Manfred from serious harm. Thank you for his courage in defending our brother Bobo. Bless him in the endeavors and keep him in the counsel of the wise." Rev walked away. Bemused, Manfred watched the older man stride over to Midnight Pond, presumably to bless Bobo in the same manner. He wasn't surprised his cell phone began to ring, or that the caller was Fiji. "The Rev gave you a blessing," she said. "I saw it out the front window. What happened last night? Because I'm really, really tired of being left out." "You didn't hear me scream like a stuck pig?" "No, what time was that?" "A little after 10, he said. "Bobo and I got jumped on our way home from Joe and Chewy's." "Is Bobo all right?" He couldn't miss the alarm in her voice. "Sure, though I have a broken leg and a concussion," he said, and then had to listen to Fiji apologize for several seconds before he could break in to tell her he had exaggerated. "I do have an herbal remedy that would make you feel better," she said tentatively. It's nothing crazy. I mean, it's all natural." So was pig shit, but Manfred refrained from saying that. "I'll give it a try," he said bravely. "I've never been in a real fight before, and it didn't agree with me." "Not a good part of a balanced lifestyle," she said, a hint of laughter in her voice, and after a few minutes she was carrying a mug across the road, its contents steaming. "Drink all of this," she said, "and if it works for you, I don't mind making you some more." Manfred supposed you would call it tea because it was made from steeped vegetation. The hot drink didn't taste good, but it wasn't disgusting either. Since he didn't want to offend Fiji, and she was standing right in his living room with her eyes on him, he sipped until it was gone. He handed Fiji the mug. Instead of thanking her and making it clear he needed to get right back to work, his original plan, he found himself sitting on the couch in the former dining room with Fiji, telling her all about the evening before. She listened with wide eyes. So they said they lived in Free State of Strongfield, and they actually mentioned the Men of Liberty, she said when he had finished, and that their 2 buddies had come here and never returned from the fabulous Free State, which I suspect is nowhere but in their little minds. "That sums it up," Manfred agreed. Peachy's face did not adapt to grim and serious very well, but that was how she looked. "Do you know anything about the two vanishing friends?" he asked. "No, I do not," she said firmly. "I never saw them, and I don't know where they are now." Manfred thought she was being at least partially truthful. "But I think it's very suspicious that they say they belong to the same organization of wackos that Aubrey's deceased husband belonged to." Another knock caught them by both surprise. Manfred glanced out the peephole before he opened the door. Arthur Smith had been able to hear him walk across the creaking wood floor, so Manfred figured he had to let him in. "Sheriff," he said, "what can we do for you today?" "My neighbor is here, so maybe you can kill 2 birds with 1 stone. "Miss Kavanaugh," the sheriff said, ducking his head and removing his hat. "You doing okay today?" "Yes, fine, thank you," Fiji said. "I brought Manfred one of my herbal remedies for soreness. Manfred, are you feeling better?" "I am," he said, trying not to sound surprised. He shifted his shoulders experimentally and bent to touch his toes. Yes, he was actually almost pain-free. "The 2 men who attacked Mr. Bernardo and Mr. Winthrop have gotten a public defender," Arthur Smith says. "And on the advice of their counsel, they're not talking to me anymore. They've abandoned their Men of Liberty spiel since I think the lawyer told them it made them sound crazier and more dangerous than just saying that they jumped some guys in the alley because they thought that they were being jumped themselves. What were they doing in the alley behind the gas station anyway? I'm sure he asked them that. Ooh, sorry. They don't seem to feel they have to explain their presence, Arthur Smith said dryly. That's what the lawyer told him to say. So, are they going to get out of jail? Fiji looked as though Smith had told her the truth about Santa Claus. They may, Smith admitted. He ran a hand over his close-cropped hair. He settled on a straight-backed chair opposite the couch, and he turned his hat in his hands as he sat there. Of the two, only one of them had any kind of arrest record, Zane Green, and that one was just a bar fight. The guy he beat up didn't press charges. A bar close to here? Manfred asked. Yeah, the cartoon saloon. Manfred started to ask where it was, but Fiji shot him a narrowed eye look that said, "Don't draw attention to this by asking about it." Instead, he said, "So the whole incident's over for now, is what you're telling us, and you're not getting anywhere on Aubrey Hamilton's death." I want to say that. The coroner confirmed the body is that of Aubrey Hamilton Lowry, and her parents are claiming the body for burial when we release it. Fiji looked startled, as if the concept of Audrey's parents taking charge was a surprise to her. Of course there's no reason why her parents wouldn't grieve, though Aubrey was, she murmured and then stopped abruptly. It was, in a more public voice, Fiji said, "I hope they'll keep Bobo in the loop with the funeral plans. That would mean a lot to him." The sheriff, who had gotten up to leave, looked at Fiji as if she'd grown another head or begun talking to Urdu. "That's hardly likely," Smith said. "They think he killed her." Manfred, who had turned to Fiji, saw all the color drain from her face, and then fled back. He thought she might faint. He was glad she hadn't stood up. "He loved her," Fiji faltered. "They can't think that." Arthur Smith looked at her with a lot more interest. "Think about it, Miss Kavanagh. She comes here to live with him. She vanishes. Her body turns up in a riverbed close by. They didn't report her missing right away. We might think his reasons are understandable, but the Hamiltons don't. He admits he didn't search for her. She's the widow of a white supremacist. You know those men Mr. Barretta's attackers claim are missing? They're white supremacists too, though Green and Spratt call themselves patriots. It's clear they're in the same boat politically." "But he thought she'd gone all on her own," Fiji said stubbornly. "Why would he look for someone who kicked him out to the curb? On the other hand, who else had reason to want her dead?" His eyes were intent on her face. Given the company she kept, the associates of her husband, but she couldn't say anything else without revealing information she wanted to keep quiet. More importantly, information that Bobo wanted to keep quiet. She found herself on her feet, feeling a little wobbly, but practically bursting with things she wished she could say. Smith said, "Just because she hung out with a crowd we consider over the political edge doesn't mean her death was anything but personal, or even accidental. The medical examiner's still looking at her." Manfred said, "Fiji, don't worry. They'll find out who did it, and that person won't be Bobo. Sheriff, thanks for coming by to let me know about those guys. If you need me again, you know where I am." He was all smiles and geniality, and as he walked Sheriff Smith to the door, but when the door closed behind him, Manfred turned to give Fiji a very grim face. "From the way you're looking at me, I screwed up," she said. "Of course you did," Manfred said. "You acted like you were defending your kid from a bully. Bobo's a grown man. He can look out for himself. The more you go on in defense, the more Smith's going to think that there's a great reason you're protecting Bobo." Fiji muttered, "Aside from the fact that I'm an idiot?" "I know you're not. I know you're his good friend." Out of mercy, Manfred did not say it, "because you're clearly nuts about him." Also, he had no desire to be frozen into a statue for an indeterminate length of time. "So you're going to the cartoon saloon with me, right?" Fiji said. "Wait, are we police?" "No, we're not going there." "But we have to find out more. Why didn't the other guy in the fight press charges?" "Why? Maybe because he didn't want to spend time in court, or because he decided he'd been in the wrong too. Or maybe he just wants to wait until he can catch his same guy alone in an alley and get his own revenge." Fiji was practically tapping her foot, waiting for him to finish speaking. "We have to try to find him." she said, and Manfred threw up his hands. Okay, but we're not going by ourselves. Olivia, Fiji said, and the proposed expedition suddenly became a little more interesting to Manfred. You think she'd go with us? I think if we ask her the right way, she will, Fiji said. She looked at her watch. She's not going to be up for a while, so I'll try her this afternoon. What about Lemuel? He's pretty capable, Manfred offered. He doesn't go out much, Fiji said. I mean, he only goes out at night, and most nights he's working in the pawn shop. Besides, it's too scary, and no one would talk to us. Manfred did not want to think about this too close or at all. So why do you want to take Olivia? Fiji's eyes went wide. She's very good at finding out things, she replied. That's kind of her business. We've got to get a name. Really? What does she do? Manfred didn't realize he'd gotten into forbidden territory until he saw Fiji give him a very direct look. Okay, I overstepped. You asked her. Let me know what she says. I'll do that. Fiji went to the door. I hope the tea helped. Yes, thanks, he said, rotating his shoulders. I'm a lot better. Great. Her smile was radiant. That was Aunt Mildred's recipe. Manfred was almost curious enough to ask what had been in it, but he was afraid to find out. He said she must have been a great witch. Peachy said, You have no idea. She was all cheer when she left. He saw Mr. Snuggles sitting at the edge of her yard, obviously waiting for her. As Manfred watched her across the road, he saw the sheriff coming down the steps of the pawn shop. Manfred thought of going over to see Bobo to check out what the sheriff had told him, but then he thought twice. As he just pointed out to Peachy, Bobo was a grown-up, and he can handle himself. Let's see. How are we doing? Checking the time. All right. Yep, I think that is a good place to end on chapter 17. The white supremacist stuff. Yeah, Charlene Harris has been writing these books for like 2 decades, between the Sookie Stackhouse series and Midnight, Texas, and her other ones. And they're all based in the South. And, they all deal with a whole bunch of different stuff that she knows, from her experiences down there. So there are white supremacist groups in different aspects of her stories, but they're just like characters and they don't drive the story, There's a lot of more, I think, in the Sookie series because they use vampirism as like a kind of like analogy for like coming out. So, there's not just white supremacists, there's also like vampire hate cults or like people who like, I don't know, there's all this, the vampire rights stuff and that. But yeah, so yeah, she's not afraid to play around with it, but she definitely isn't. I don't think she's just like, standing on a soapbox and preaching it. It's just like there's characters who get mixed up with that stuff. But this is actually, I would say that this book is probably the most forward she gets as far as introducing characters go, though. Because I think since she had such a long go with the Sookie Stackhouse series, she had more time to introduce more unique personalities and to like work them into the story and like make you get used to it. And so now with like her Midnight books, she's just like, okay, if you know my books, I don't have to try as hard, or like I don't feel like I need to hold hand. So she doesn't feel like she needs to hold your hand. So yeah, so she's just like, yeah, there's all these characters. They all live in this town. Here you go. So yeah, and one of them happens to be messed up with, some supremacy stuff in his past. They all have skeletons, am I right? But yeah, it does definitely make it get interesting though, right? Because it's like, is it because of that, or is it a red herring? We do live in a world of vampires and witches and psychics. So, I don't know. We're only up to chapter 17. We're getting there. We're almost halfway. But I'm going to end it here. And thank you for whoever stuck it out the longest, or just basically everybody who hung out with me while I was reading tonight. I will read some more on Sunday, probably a little less than this, but it is my goal to go through the entire trilogy. The books are short, so I don't know. I can't imagine it will take forever. But until then, I hope you guys have a really good night. I will try to recuperate my voice and be able to read again on Sunday night. So I hope you guys have get to bed at a decent time, y'all. Have a good weekend. So I bid you adieu.